The gavel struck once, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. Every eye turned toward the man seated at the bench, Judge Robert Williams, respected for his fairness, his composure, and his reputation as a man untouched by bias. But at that moment, Robert felt his chest tighten, his breath falter. The defendant, standing in shackles, was not a stranger to him. It was Marcus Carter. A face from decades earlier, a boyhood friend, the one who had once shielded Robert from bullies when he was weak and defenseless. A friend who had grown up only a few blocks away, yet in a world shaped by different rules. Now Marcus stood accused of armed robbery, facing decades in prison. And as Robert looked at him, he knew this case would not only test the law but would test his conscience in ways the public could never imagine. Robert Williams had always believed in law. He built his career on the idea that justice was blind, that rules protected fairness, that order meant safety. Yet deep inside, he knew justice had not been blind when he was a child. He grew up in a small southern town during the late 1960s. Segregation had ended on paper, but in practice, the town was still sharply divided. Robert was the son of a white factory worker who drank too much and a mother who cleaned houses to make ends meet. They lived paycheck to paycheck, scraping by in a home that always felt one gust of wind away from falling apart. Marcus Carter lived in the same town, but on the other side of the invisible lines that dictated opportunity. His neighborhood was neglected by city officials. Streets cracked, schools overcrowded, parks filled with broken swings and rusting metal. Yet Marcus carried himself with a dignity that seemed larger than the world he was born into. Robert still remembered the day they met. He was 11, scrawny, stuttering, cornered by older kids behind the school. They mocked his second-hand clothes, shoved him to the ground, and laughed at his stumbling words. Then Marcus appeared. He stood tall, eyes fierce, and with nothing but his presence, he scattered the bullies. From that day, Robert followed Marcus like a shadow. They played basketball on cracked courts, shared sandwiches when food was scarce, and spoke about dreams bigger than their surroundings. Robert wanted to be a lawyer, and Marcus wanted to be a teacher. For a few years, it felt like both boys could escape the weight of their circumstances. But life in America did not treat them equally. Robert's small mistakes, sneaking into a store, breaking curfew, were dismissed with warnings. Marcus's presence in the wrong place was considered suspicious. He was stopped, questioned, frisked. Once, at 14, he was arrested for loitering when walking home after basketball practice. That record would follow him for years. Robert's family scraped together enough to send him to college. Marcus's mother begged him to focus on survival. Robert climbed step by step, law school, assistant district attorney, finally judge. Marcus remained in a cycle of jobs and surveillance, often targeted more for who he was than for what he did. And now here they were. Judge and defendant. Childhood friends separated not just by years but by the system itself. Robert felt the eyes of the courtroom on him. Reporters scribbled in notebooks. Lawyers sharpened their arguments. Protesters outside chanted slogans about police brutality. But all Robert could see was Marcus, standing shackled, accused of armed robbery. A crime Robert wasn't sure he had committed. The stage was set. The trial would not simply be about guilt or innocence. It would become a mirror, reflecting the broken promises of justice, the uneven scales of opportunity, and the haunting truth of how two boys from the same town could end up on opposite sides of the bench. The trial began under heavy scrutiny. Cameras were not allowed inside, but reporters swarmed the courthouse steps daily, fueling headlines with sensational phrases like community activist or career criminal, and the judge who knows the defendant. Rumors spread quickly that Robert had personal ties to Marcus, though no one could prove it. The prosecution came out strong. Their case leaned heavily on eyewitness accounts, shaky but dramatic. A store clerk testified that Marcus looked like the man who had robbed the convenience store, though his description had changed multiple times in police reports. Surveillance footage placed someone resembling Marcus near the store, but the timestamp conflicted with police records. Still, the prosecution played their part well. They emphasized Marcus's past arrests, painting him as reckless, prone to anger, someone who had always been a problem. The defense countered, but their resources were limited. They argued Marcus was mentoring teens at a community center that night, with several young witnesses ready to confirm it. But those witnesses were dismissed by jurors as biased, their credibility undermined by subtle stereotypes. The jury leaned in whenever the prosecution spoke, but grew restless during defense testimony. Robert watched, his gavel steady, his face unreadable. Inside, he boiled. He thought of the nights Marcus had called him brother. He thought of the unfair arrests, the police who had looked at Marcus with suspicion from the age of 12. He thought of his own mistakes that had been forgiven. As each witness took the stand, Robert felt the weight of unspoken bias pressing in. The jury pool itself reflected the divide, mostly white, middle-aged, chosen from neighborhoods far removed from Marcus's community. When Marcus's mother took the stand, her trembling voice was interrupted twice by objections from the prosecution, objections the jury seemed to welcome. Robert went home each night haunted. He reread evidence. He studied timelines. He felt the pressure of the robe he wore, a robe that symbolized neutrality but demanded silence. One evening, he noticed the timestamp discrepancy again. The footage showed Marcus near the store at 9:30 p.m. But police records stated they had spotted and detained him at a different location at nearly the same time. It was impossible for both to be true. The thought gnawed at him. Was this evidence manipulated? Was the prosecution relying on altered facts to secure a conviction? He thought of his oath as a judge, impartial, fair, bound by law. But he also thought of Marcus's life, hanging in the balance because of a system that rarely gave second chances to black men. Outside the courthouse, protests grew larger. Chants of "Justice for Marcus" echoed. News outlets debated whether Robert could remain unbiased. Some accused him of favoritism. Others demanded he come down hard to prove he was not partial. Inside, the tension became unbearable. Each testimony painted Marcus as either a menace or a mentor. Each piece of evidence felt twisted, incomplete, or corrupted by bias. And Robert knew that soon, he would have to guide the jury toward a verdict. The final day arrived like a storm. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, the press lining the back walls. Robert felt the gravity in his bones. The prosecution delivered their closing argument with fire. They painted Marcus as dangerous, insisting the community needed protection. They pointed to his past, not convictions, but arrests, each. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood. The entire courtroom leaned forward. Not guilty. The words cracked the air like lightning. Gasps echoed. Marcus's mother cried out in relief. Protesters outside erupted in cheers. The prosecution sat stunned, their case shattered. Robert lowered his head, relief flooding through him. He had not freed Marcus, the jury had. But he knew his careful choice to emphasize fairness had opened the door to truth. When the courtroom cleared, Robert sat alone, the gavel still in his hand. He thought of the boy who had once shielded him from bullies, and of the man who now walked free, scarred but unbroken. Marcus's freedom was a victory, but Robert knew it was fragile. The system remained stacked against countless others. For every Marcus, there were dozens who lacked the evidence, the support, the visibility, the silent ally wearing robes at the bench. Marcus promised his mother he would continue his community work. He told reporters he would not be defined by the trial but would use it to inspire others. His face, once portrayed as threatening, became a symbol of resilience. For Robert, the trial was a reckoning. He began speaking publicly, not about Marcus specifically, but about the system. He described how evidence could be twisted, how juries carried unspoken bias, how the law could destroy lives if wielded carelessly. He faced backlash. Some accused him of politicizing his role. Others called for his resignation. Yet many saw his courage as a spark. Community leaders invited him to panels. Law students cited his speeches. Slowly, Robert became a reluctant but powerful voice for reform. The story of Robert and Marcus spread far beyond their town. It was retold in classrooms, news segments, and community gatherings. Not as a story of triumph, but as a mirror of the brokenness still unresolved. And it left behind a haunting question, one that lingered in every courtroom, every jury box, every silent gavel strike. If justice requires someone powerful to notice, then how many are still condemned in silence, their voices unheard, their truth buried beneath the weight of prejudice? Then it was Robert's turn. Judges were expected to be neutral in their jury instructions. But neutrality in the face of prejudice was not justice. His voice carried through the hushed room. He spoke of the burden of proof, of the sacred responsibility jurors carried. He reminded them that past arrests did not equal guilt. He asked them to look carefully at the evidence, at the conflicting timelines, at the lack of physical proof. He did not mention Marcus's name with affection, nor his personal history. But his words were heavy, layered with a truth the jury could not ignore. The jury deliberated for hours. The courthouse buzzed. Protesters outside grew louder. Inside, Robert sat still, his hands clasped, his heart pounding. He knew his words had walked a fine line, too much emotion, and he could be accused of bias, too little and Marcus would be condemned, one framed as proof of a pattern. They ended with a plea for safety, warning that letting Marcus walk free would endanger others. The defense attorney rose next, weary but determined. They highlighted the contradictions, the unreliable witnesses, the community center alibi. They reminded the jury that suspicion was not proof, that doubt was reasonable, that justice demanded fairness. Yet their words seemed fragile against the prosecution's polished narrative.